Welcome to another lecture of Introduction to Psychology. Today we are going to be continuing our conversation about biological psychology, which is more commonly known as behavioral neuroscience. In this lecture, we'll be focusing on the brain and brain parts and how it controls specific behaviors. It would be helpful for you, I think, if you could create kind of a chart with a column that indicates the brain region and the column next to it describing the function of that brain region. So we're going to be going through a whole bunch of neuroanatomy. You won't need to identify brain regions specifically, but you will need to know what's called functional neuroanatomy, what the brain area does in addition to what it's called. So I don't want to disappoint. Here's your dad joke of the day. When does a joke become a dad joke? When it becomes apparent. Ha 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 ha. All right, let's continue. So largely, the nervous system can be broken up into two major divisions. The first one is the central nervous system, and the second is the peripheral nervous system. So those are the two major divisions of the entire nervous system in our body, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and you can remember that it's the brain and spinal cord because these two structures are encased in bone. The rest of the nerves that leave the brain and the spinal cord are part of the peripheral nervous system. So pretty much any nerve in your body is part of the peripheral nervous system. You don't need to worry about the nerves in blue and red. We'll talk about kind of the different areas or the different divisions of the peripheral nervous system later, but we're going to be diving a lot into the brain specifically, spending very little time in the spinal cord, and we'll talk about what these brain areas do. Before we launch into the brain regions, I have to give you an introduction to kind of general brain divisions or nervous system divisions. It's largely termed what it is based on how the brain develops. So what you're looking at here is a 3-week-old fetus's nervous system. It's unfortunately not color-coded this way in the fetus, but already at 3 weeks following conception, we can see kind of structures forming that are distinct from one another. The front half of the structure of this rudimentary nervous system is called the forebrain. The middle part, not surprisingly, is called the midbrain. And then the last kind of end portion of this rudimentary nervous system is called the hindbrain. The spinal cord continues past the brain. Again, that develops as well. But as we go through development, let's take a look at 7 weeks, you'll see the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain are adding more structures. They're developing complexity, and they're starting to have kind of little buds for what will eventually turn into nerves exiting the brain, and that's happening in the spinal cord too. As we go to 11 weeks, the kind of major divisions of the brain have formed, but you can still see what is the forebrain, the midbrain, and hindbrain. And at birth, the forebrain kind of takes over the entire brain, and that's what we can largely see in a whole brain that hasn't been cut up. You see the forebrain, and you can see kind of a glimpse of the hindbrain. What is completely hidden and in a fully formed brain is the midbrain. You can only access the midbrain deep within the brain once you slice it and cut it open to see the insides. What you're looking at here is kind of a top-down view. So the nose would be here. Whoa, I don't know why my mouse did that. The ears would be on either side. This is the back of the head. So you're looking at the brain from the top, from the person's top of their head. And this is what the brain looks like at birth. It is made up of 2 symmetrical halves called hemispheres, and there's a big, huge groove in the middle. We'll tell you what these grooves are called in the coming slide. But if we were to slice down right down the center, creating 2 equal halves, this is what we would see. The brain is incredibly complex. It is unlike any organ in your body, and so it makes sense that this complex structure then gives rise to the complexity that we know human behavior to be. And so, as I mentioned, the midbrain is hidden. Here's the midbrain right here. You can't really see it. And then this is kind of the hindbrain, or the brainstem, as we call it. We're going to be spending a lot of time in this forebrain area of the brain, which has the most interesting functions with regard to human behavior. And so we're going to spend a lot of time there, but we will also talk about structures below the forebrain. So we've already covered this in prior slides. There are 3 divisions of the brain: the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. We're going to be spending a lot of time in the forebrain. I already mentioned this. The forebrain can be broken up into 2 symmetrical hemispheres, kind of like the hemispheres of the Earth. They are the left and right hemispheres of the forebrain. What covers the outer portion, that brown convoluted structure, that's called the cerebral cortex. The word cortex literally means bark, and so it is the outer covering of the forebrain and the structures that make us uniquely human. But before I continue, I want to highlight the work of a neuroscientist, a neurobiologist, I guess is the better term for it, Eric Jarvis. He studies the neuroanatomy of the songbird to better understand how it might give rise to language. And so if you're doing Eric Jarvis for your biography, he has a super interesting kind of life trajectory that ultimately led him to neuroscience. But he originally started off as a dancer and was going to become a professional dancer, but then, not surprisingly, neuroscience kind of drew him in and piqued his interest more. Okay, let's continue. So let's dive into the cerebral cortex a little bit more. So the cerebral cortex is the outer covering of the brain, the bark of the brain, so to speak. You'll see that it's got lots of convolutions. It is not a smooth structure. Part of the reason why the human brain contains these convolutions is to increase surface area. So if we had to jam as many neurons as our brain has, and we did not have these convolutions, we would have a ginormous head, and our neck wouldn't be able to support it. So evolutionarily, to kind of accommodate the additional neurons that the human brain evolved to have, it increased the surface area by creating these convolutions. The grooves and bumps in our brain have special names. The smaller grooves are called sulci or sulcus, so this would be C-U-S. Those are the smaller grooves or divots. The larger grooves are known as fissures, kind of like the fissures of your brain. I mean, of the earth, not your brain, also of your brain, but more of the earth. The fissures in the earth represent these kind of deep, massive grooves. But fissures, you've already seen one. There is a longitudinal fissure, the one that kind of divides the 2 hemispheres of the brain. That's a fissure. That's a very deep groove. All the bulges are collectively known as gyri, and a singular, they're known as gyrus. We can divide the cortex into 4 functional lobes, and so we're teaching you these lobes as though they each have functions, but really these functions overlap across lobes. So as we get into more higher order functions, the lobes actually share functional connections with each other. But the 4 lobes of the cortex are the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. So again, just to remind you of what you're seeing, we're looking at the brain from the top down. So the nose would be here. Here's the back of the brain, ears on either side. This view is looking at it from the side of the brain. So the nose would be here, the back of the head is here, and this is the top of the head. Okay, So this massive groove here is a fissure. It's the longitudinal fissure, the one that divides the two hemispheres in half. The frontal lobe can be seen here in pink. It is the lobe that you can find right behind your forehead. The occipital lobe is found all the way in the back of the head. So if you kind of touch the back of your head, you are just above the occipital lobe of the skull. The temporal lobe, shown here from the side view, you can't see the temporal lobe from the top view, but the temporal lobe can be seen here in yellow. And if you go to kind of your temples, to massage your temples right above your ears, that's exactly where the temporal lobe is located. The parietal lobe is sandwiched between the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe. It's shown here in kind of an off-white. I don't know why I changed color, but here the parietal lobe is shown in blue. Okay, so again, you don't need to necessarily know where these lobes are located. I would rather you know what they do. So let's tackle what they do. And this diagram kind of illustrates some of their functions. But within each lobe, there are specific functions, major functions it handles. It's not the only functions it handles, but this is what the lobes are known for. The frontal lobe handles motor functions, so it's handling all voluntary movement. Anytime you want to do something, particularly with, your legs or your hands, it's likely that it involves the frontal lobe. There are also structures in the frontal lobe that handle higher cognitive functions, and we'll talk about those higher cognitive functions in a second. The parietal lobe handles what's known as somatosensory function. Soma is another word for cell body. So in this case, we're referring to body sensations. So somatosensory functions include things like touch, temperature, pain, pressure, all of those things that we can feel with our skin senses are handled by the parietal lobe. In addition, the parietal lobe handles something known as proprioception, which is called referring to body position. So if you close your eyes and move any body part, you know roughly where that body part is relative to you, and that's proprioception, and that's the actions of the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe, which is located here right behind your temples, handles audition, which is a fancy word for hearing. And one way you can remember that the temporal lobe handles hearing is because it's the lobe closest to your ears. Hearing is also important for language, and that also resides in the temporal lobe. And then finally, we've talked about a structure called the hippocampus. It lives in the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe, because it houses the hippocampus, is considered to also control learning and memory. The occipital lobe has one function and one function alone in the human brain, and that's to handle vision. Human beings rely on their sense of vision so much that it's devoted an entire, or I should say evolution has devoted an entire lobe solely for that particular sense. Within the frontal lobe, so earlier I mentioned higher cognitive functions, the frontal lobe houses a really important and the most evolved structure called the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is located right here. The reason why it's called the prefrontal cortex is because it lives at the very tip of the frontal lobe. So when you're actually touching your forehead, it is right in front of your frontal lobe. This particular structure is what makes us uniquely human. It handles what's called executive functions. Functions such as planning, decision-making, personality, something called working memory that I'll mention in a second, what that is, as well as behavioral inhibition. So working memory is a really important component of being able to function. Working memory allows us to hold information in our mind temporarily until we are ready to use it. So I like to use this as an example to demonstrate working memory. If you've ever played a board game or chess or card games where you kind of need to hold the rules of the game in your mind as you're playing it, that's working memory. So being able to hold information in your mind until you're about to use it, that's your prefrontal cortex allowing you to do that. Behavioral inhibition represents the urge to act, but not. And so when we are younger, our prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. And so we are less able to behaviorally inhibit. And kids, for example, say whatever comes to their mind, or they want to do whatever they feel like doing because they have no ability to kind of delay these urges. Delayed gratification is something that is handled by the prefrontal cortex. So you should know that the prefrontal cortex does not fully develop until you're 25 years old. And then once you're 25, this brain region slowly deteriorates over time. So it's important to keep in mind that even though many teenagers may feel like adults and be given the title of adult at 18, their brains, their ability to reason and handle decision making is not fully developed until they're 25. So the two hemispheres, despite being symmetrical, actually have different functions. You may have heard the myth that when you're left brain, you are more analytical, and when you're right brain, you're more artsy, or I can't remember which is which, but that is completely a myth. There are functions that are unique to the hemispheres, but they typically handle similar functions. So each brain hemisphere actually controls the opposite side of the body. So your left hemisphere actually controls the right side of your body and vice versa. And so when people end up getting strokes where they kind of have brain damage as a result of an aneurysm, simply looking at what half of their body is paralyzed, a doctor can determine which half of their brain the stroke occurred in. The left hemisphere is specialized for language in most people, regardless of handedness. And the right hemisphere is important for things like spatial relationships, where things are in space relative to each other or to you, as well as for interpreting emotional expressions on people's faces. But the two hemispheres are constantly exchanging information with each other through a humongous structure called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum contains a set of axons. There are millions of bundles of axons that are transporting information from both halves of the cortex to the other side. So they are carrying information from the left hemisphere to the right and vice versa. If the corpus callosum is damaged or cut in some way, the two hemispheres would not be able to share information. At least the two cortical hemispheres would not be able to share information completely. To kind of show you how massive this structure is, you're looking at a cartoon here. So this is the side view of the brain. We've cut the brain in half, and you're looking at the inside view of the brain. What's colored in purple here is the corpus callosum. So it's a pretty large structure, and it makes sense because its sole purpose is to connect and communicate between the two hemispheres. So like all of this is filled with neurons, and those neurons are transmitting their axons through the corpus callosum to the other half of the brain. If we were to remove all of this cortical structure, this is what you would see. You would see massive bundles kind of going back and forth from the two halves of the brain. So we're looking at the corpus callosum from the top down. So the nose would be here, the back of the head's here. And so when we remove all of this cortex, What's left are these massive bundles of axons on either side. These are not individual axons, because axons are, you need a microscope to see them, but these represent bundles of thousands of axons grouped together to allow us to see them. If you're curious, here's an actual dissection of the corpus callosum. Here's the corpus callosum, and here are all these bundles of axons entering the cortex on either side. I think this is absolutely beautiful, but it just goes to show you that our brains and its ability to communicate with each half is really important for our ability to function. And so you would imagine that if we were to cut this corpus callosum, that we might not be able to function. There are, in fact, patients who have seizures, severe epilepsy where medication doesn't help them and they end up with hundreds of seizures a day. They end up cutting their corpus callosum, and those patients are called split brain patients. I want to mention why this is an important treatment for seizures that don't respond to medication. What ends up happening with seizures is that they often start in one half of the brain, typically the hippocampus, but because the entire brain is connected, the seizure developing in one small area ends up going to the entire brain. By cutting the corpus callosum, we're preventing the movement of that seizure from one side of the brain to the other half, allowing the patient to function better, right? But you would imagine cutting the corpus callosum would create massive problems, right? So surprisingly, split brain patients don't seem to be very different with regard to their ability to function. There's a really clever scientist called Mike Gazzaniga. He was in Dartmouth at the time that he did these experiments. But what he did was he had those split brain patients stare at kind of a center dot and not move their eyes. Whoops, I don't know why I did that. Let me erase it. Give me 1 second. So he asked them to stare on a computer screen at a dot in the center. And one of the things that you should know is that information from the left visual field ends up in the right hemisphere, and information from the right visual field ends up in the left hemisphere. And just keep in mind that it's the left hemisphere that carries language information, so the ability to speak, and the left hemisphere controls the right hand. Okay, hopefully you're with me. So they quickly show a picture of this word on the screen, and then they ask the person to write down with their right hand what word they saw. They write down the word band, because the band is on the right visual field. It entered the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere handles language, and through controlling the right hand was able to write band. But when this person was asked to point to the object it saw, it pointed to hat, because that's the word it saw. The right hemisphere saw the word hat, so the right hemisphere saw the word hat, right? And then this right hemisphere controlled the left hand, which was used to point to the word hat. So because the two halves are not communicating with each other, people with split brain have two halves that seem to be functioning independently of one another. But our eyes are actually constantly moving, so both hemispheres are getting information from all visual fields. So you wouldn't know somebody is a split brain patient except in experiments like this. If you're super curious about split brain patients, there are tons of YouTube videos with Mike Gazzaniga kind of studying this one patient, Joe. And to me, it's really incredible because he has Joe kind of draw with both his hands at the same time and is able to do it because his two halves are not speaking to one another, so they can independently work to control the two hands to draw different things. I can't do that, but the split brain patient can. All right, now we're going to transition to subcortical structures. So some of these structures are still in the forebrain, but we're also going to be talking a lot about hindbrain structures. The first forebrain structure that lives below the cortex, that's what this is, subcortical, is the thalamus. So here's the thalamus, right here. The thalamus is called the relay center of the brain because any sensory information entering the sense organs before it goes to the cortex where experience or perception happens has to go through the thalamus first. So I like to think of the thalamus as kind of like the administrative assistant to the cortex that is the CEO. In addition, the thalamus carries information from the spinal cord to the cortex as well as from the cortex to the spinal cord. So it's kind of like a two-way path. The hypothalamus, so hypo means below, sits just below the thalamus, and here's the structure right here. The hypothalamus is important for regulating homeostatic functions, things like hunger, thirst, temperature regulation, sex, as well as many other motivated behaviors. The hypothalamus, but this is important, is the brain area that controls all hormone release for your entire body. So if there's any hormone that's released from any gland in your body, chances are the hypothalamus controls its release. Here's the pons. So now we're in the hindbrain or brainstem. The pons is this egg-shaped like structure over here that I'm circling. It controls muscles of the head. What the pons allows us to do is when we are moving forward, it ensures that our head stays over our body. If the pons was not working, as our body moved forward, our head would kind of dip backwards, kind of like what happens when you get whiplash in a car accident. But the pons helps our head maintain itself over our body as our body moves forward. The medulla, which sits right below the pons, right here, controls some muscles of the head, but its primary function is to control vital functions of the organs. So it has a massive nerve that goes into kind of your what's called viscera, but it's your gut, and it controls things like digestion, heart rate, breathing, and your diaphragm control. So if you destroy the medulla in some accident, you would not be able to stay alive because its sole purpose is to kind of handle the functions that keep you alive, like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, glucose levels, etc., etc. The final kind of brainstem or hindbrain structure is this gray structure here called the cerebellum. It controls muscle coordination or coordination of movement. So I mentioned earlier that the frontal lobe handles voluntary function, but really it makes the decisions for voluntary movement. The cerebellum is what controls the voluntary movement in real time. So it gets a lot of sensory information from the spinal cord and pons, and it decides how to adjust movement in real time as you're attempting to perform it. The spinal cord controls a crap ton of muscles all over your body, so essentially muscles from the neck down. It also gathers a lot of information from the body, so information about your skin, about your gut, anything that's happening at the neck down. The spinal cord is gathering that information and sending it to the brain. But what makes the spinal cord really unique is that it has reflexes that are solely present or controlled by the spinal cord and not the brain. So if you've ever gone to the doctor's office and they kind of whack your knee and your knee moves and you're like, oh my God, how did that happen? I didn't do it. That's a reflex. That's a reflex that's controlled solely by your spinal cord. The reason why it feels weird is because your leg moves, and only after your leg moves do you get information that your legs moved, because your brain didn't control it. So the spinal cord handles all reflexes, including things like, getting your hand away from a really hot stove or stepping on something sharp. It helps you pull your leg away quickly. All of that happens without the involvement of the brain. So we're going to talk about a couple of automatic systems. Some of these are controlled by the peripheral nervous system, but the first one is the endocrine system. So the endocrine system involves or includes all the glands in your body that produce hormones and release them into the bloodstream. Hormones are similar to neurotransmitters, except that instead of being released across the synapse, they are released into the bloodstream, and then wherever the blood goes, technically the hormones can travel as well. We've got glands for hormones all over our body. You don't need to worry about knowing what these glands are, but if you're curious, these are all the different glands and the hormones that they release, as well as the functions of those hormones, are listed here. But just to illustrate, there's tons of hormones produced all over our body, and the control of the hormones being released from those glands is handled by the hypothalamus. It is considered kind of the master gland of the entire endocrine system, even though it's a brain structure. The other automatic system that exists within our nervous system, and it's part of the peripheral nervous system, it's called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is not voluntary, it's involuntary, and it controls all things related to your organs. So there's a voluntary portion of the peripheral nervous system called the somatic nervous system, but the autonomic nervous system represents the involuntary portion of our peripheral nervous system. It is two parts: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system handles fight or flight response, the stress response. And that's how you can remember what the sympathetic nervous system does, because the sympathetic S starts with the same letter as the word stress. So the sympathetic nervous system is really important for expending energy and readying our body for threat. It is opposed by the parasympathetic nervous system, which does the complete opposite. It works to conserve energy and engage in behaviors that are associated with less stress, more relaxation. To kind of illustrate, the fact that both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system speak to the same organs, that's what you're seeing here. So this half is the sympathetic, this half is the parasympathetic, but they're both speaking to all the organs of the body. They are never active at the same time. So when we are feeling stressed or anxious, chances are your sympathetic nervous system is active. For most of us, for most of the time, hopefully, our parasympathetic nervous system is active, which is important for conserving energy. We've got a couple more things to talk about in this lecture before I show you your exit ticket. Neuroplasticity is an important component of neuroscience or biological psychology, because they used to think that the adult human brain was incapable of change, that once you were a particular age, you were kind of done for in terms of being able to learn new things or create new neurons. We know now that that's not the case at all. Neuroplasticity occurs all the time in the human brain. Whenever you learn something new, your brain physically changes. It grows a connection that it didn't have there before. So your brain is actually a very dynamic, changing organ that modifies itself as a result of experience. So when you learn something new, your brain is actually physically changing to accommodate that new information. And the brain remains plastic well into 80s, at least that's how far out research has examined the plastic brain. So we also make new brain cells in the hippocampus, and those new brain cells continue forming, granted at a slower rate when we're older, in the hippocampus as old as 80-year-olds. And so experiences, as we go through life, these experiences are what's changing the connections in our brain. And so if we become really proficient at something, some task, some skill, those mastery of those skills represent changes in the brain. So for example, if we were to compare the motor cortex of a musician compared to somebody who doesn't play an instrument, their brains would look very different. Musicians would have a much larger motor cortex to accommodate, fine motor movements that they have to engage in to play their instruments, compared to somebody who doesn't play an instrument. So their motor cortex, the person who doesn't play the instrument, would have a much smaller motor cortex. So our brain accommodates and changes as we go through life. And this also happens with kind of experiences that we have that are not necessarily even skill-based, right? Memories are stored as changes within our brain. One last piece of this lecture is something called evolutionary psychology. It is kind of a subdivision of biological psychology. I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but there are evolutionary psychologists who study kind of human behavior within this field, but they're studying human behavior from an evolutionary perspective. So they're trying to understand the why or the adaptiveness of human behavior. So how are certain behaviors more adaptive than others? In other words, how do they help promote survival, right? Like, how do they get passed along from generation to generation, assuming that they have conferred some adaptation that people with those behaviors didn't have, and so they didn't survive. They also study questions like, how do we find some people more attractive than others? So they study mate selection, for example. And then finally, forensic psychology, which is also a subdivision of evolutionary psychology, tries to understand why people commit crimes such as murder or sexual assault. So it's a component of biological psychology, but you can read more about it if you're curious on the web or in your textbook. So here's your summary for today's lecture. Finally, here are your exit ticket questions. I just want to highlight number 1. You are creating what's called an organizational chart. So this kind of schematic up here is what you're aiming for. It's not going to look like this in this shape, but what I want you to do is, we've discussed a whole bunch of brain areas, especially if you were keeping track of them. I want you to kind of show me how brain areas are related to each other. Where does the cerebral cortex fit into all of these terms? Or where do the subcortical structures live? You're going to likely start off with a central term, which is called nervous system. And then just to get you started, that's going to be divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, but then you're going to have to identify all of those structures we talked about and decide which half it's going to go into, and you might find yourself breaking it down into kind of multiple parts. So this is going to take some time. You can draw it out on a piece of paper and take a picture of it and upload it, but then you also have to answer this question, number 2. So part of the reason why there's only 2 exit ticket questions is because the organizational chart is likely going to take you some time. So you just have one other exit ticket question for this particular lecture, and that's, what is neuroplasticity and how has it affected your perspective on your ability to learn? All right, that's it. Have a good day.